The last time we talked about how the copper got into the rock. Today we're going to focus on how we got it out. Now, the copper country is unique in that we have pure copper. We call it native copper or float copper. Unlike most places that have copper locked chemically with other atoms, we have pure copper. You can find chunks of it. And in fact, Native Americans have been doing that for thousands of years. And they have traded copper harbor, Keweenaw. They have traded Keweenaw copper all over the central, what's now the United States, all the way down to Louisiana. They have found pieces of copper as Indian artifact, Native American artifacts that trace back to our copper. But things didn't really take off commercially until Michigan became a state in 1837. In 1840, the state geologist toured Michigan to try to figure out what was there and what could we make money at. His name was Douglas Houghton. The town of Houghton is named after him. And he found the Keweenaw copper and saw that people had been, picking up chunks of it and hammering it into things. But he said that it would take a lot of money to make it a profitable endeavor. But in 1842, the state signed a treaty with the Native Americans allowing opening up the area, and in 1847 1845 the first copper mines started. A lot of them at the beginning weren't profitable. The Cliff mine was the first profitable mine. In mid 1850s, the Quincy mine opened up, and also at that time the Sioux Locks opened, and that really gave the jump start to the possibility of getting this heavy ore, this heavy mineral out of the Keweenaw. There were dozens of mining operations down the spine of the Keweenaw from the cliff location all the way down through Twin Lakes. But today we're going to focus on the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company. Alexander Agassiz took over as superintendent in 1868. He's a pretty interesting guy. He went to Harvard at age 15. His dad was a famous scientist, studied glaciers, and he himself just took this job to make money. His true passion was science. Here at the Centennial rock house, you can see that the angle of the shaft matches the angle of those layers of Portage Lake volcanics and conglomerates underneath us. The skip would have pulled up out of the shaft, pulled by the hoist. It would have dumped the rock through a crusher that would have broken it into softball-sized pieces. And if there was enough copper in the ore to bother processing further, it would have been shipped off to Lake Linden. The poor rock, the rock without enough copper in it, would have been hauled out to a waste rock pile. To show you how the ore was mined out of the ground, I'd like to show you some clips from this Calumet and Hecla program. This was a video they produced in the 40s when the mines were still running strong. A couple of things about the mines. Our mines were fairly safe and fairly clean, but remember, it's still a mine. So here we are going down the shaft. Remember, that's at the same angle as the rocks are underground, so we're following those seams of copper, those veins. The man car stops at each level and lets off the workers that worked at that level, and it would do just the opposite at the end of their shift. Between the shifts, you were pretty much stuck in the mine. Once in there, they got to work. First task was drilling holes in the wall. At first, it would have been done by hand, but then by powered drills, two-man drills, one-man drills. In fact, there was kind of a big to-do about the conversion from two-man to one-man drills, and it caused a strike and all of that. Several series of holes were drilled, and then the holes were stuffed with dynamite, and they were wired so that they would go off individually but in quick succession. They didn't want them to all go off at once. because that might bring down the whole mine. But each blast cleared kind of a path for the next blast. And when they were all wired together, they moved to a safe distance. You can imagine how loud that blast would have been underground. And when everybody was clear from that level, then they would set them off. Once the pieces were blasted out of the wall, they were scooped up. This guy is called a mucker. You've probably heard the phrasing of mucking up your food. That's what this guy is doing. He's scooping it up into a tram, and the tram will pull it across the level and dump it in an awaiting skip car. The skip car is in the shaft. As much as possible, you want to have gravity doing the work for you. So although you have to lift it here against gravity, from now on, we're going to try to have gravity do the work for us. So when the tram gets over to the skip, it dumps into the skip that's awaiting below, and then that's going to get pulled up the shaft to the rock house. And there's a hoist that pulls on the cable. Originally, they actually had horses pulling on the cable, but soon that was invented or advanced to a steam hoist. Now up in the rock house, we take it higher than we have to so that we can use gravity to dump the rock into a bin that feeds a rock crusher, because the next operation can't have big chunks of rock, so we have to crush it and make sure that there's nothing larger than, say, a softball. And at this point, it's also separated. If it came from a copper-rich part of the rock, we're going to ship it to Lake Linden. If it came from a copper-poor part of the rock, we're just going to haul it out to a waste rock pile and dump it there. Here's a picture of the waste rock piles outside of Calumet. It's like a mountain. It was in its heyday. We've since used it for gravel and road construction and stuff. Because copper and ore is so heavy, it's hauled on trains mostly, because it would really be hard on the roads. Here again, to take advantage of gravity, the train doesn't go down into Lake Linden. Instead, it stays up above it on a trestle. And the bottom of the cars open up and it dumps the copper ore into the stamp mill. The stamp mill just pounds it over and over and over, first crushing it to softball or baseball size and then down to golf ball size. Eventually, the last stamp grinds it down into sand grain sizes. And the rock gets crushed, but because copper is malleable, it doesn't break apart. We then flushed it with water. Because the sand is lighter than copper, the sand gets flushed away and was deposited in Torch Lake, and the heavier copper sinks to the bottom, and we collected that. At this point, it's dried out and it's called copper concentrate. It's about 60% copper. And that's loaded onto a rail car again and shipped to the smelter in Hubbell. And when you see the term smelter, think melter, because that's what it does. It's going to melt and purify the copper. It's dumped into a furnace, and the furnace heats it up and melts it. And then it's about 2,000 degrees, I guess. And when the copper is melted, the impurities in it rise to the top, and they can be skimmed off, kind of like skimming the scum off of the copper. And what's left behind eventually is about 99.99% pure copper, and it's poured into molds. It's poured into molds, and when they harden, it is loaded up onto rail cars again, taken down. It might go out on a ship through the Soo Locks, or it might go by train, and eventually end up anywhere in the world. If you looked at buildings that were built anywhere 100 years ago, there's probably Keweenaw copper in the wires or in the plumbing. This load is going to Wolverine Tube. It's a subsidiary of Calumet and Hecla Mining Company. When it gets there, it's unloaded, and copper is malleable and ductile. Malleable means you can shape it without actually melting it. So here they are taking that copper cylinder and they're cutting it into lengths. Then they're going to heat it up, not to the melting point, but just hot enough that they can take this mandrel and punch it right through that solid piece of copper. And what comes out the bottom is a seamless copper tube that's about 10 feet long, but now it's hollow. So it took that short, solid cylinder and made it into a long copper tube without melting it. Copper is malleable, so it can be shaped without melting. And now the subsequent operations are just a matter of taking that tube and making it longer and thinner. First, they have to put a point on the end so it can fit into the next machine that draws it. It stretches it into a tube that's half as thick but twice as long. And lots of inspections along the way to make sure that the quality is controlled. Each machine makes it progressively longer and thinner. And it has to get cut and straightened once in a while, but that's the basics of the process. And they started off with that solid cylinder, and they might end up with tubes that are the size of a pencil lead, or they might end up with radiators that have bigger tubes, but the tubes have fins on them. Lots of different products get made from copper. And these products came from the Keweenaw. We were poised perfectly in time because the world needed copper for wiring, for telephone lines and electrical lines, and copper for plumbing and indoor fixtures. And we shipped it to the world. After dumping stamp sands into Torch Lake for 100 years, they discovered that there was still a lot of copper in that sand. So they built two of these dredges. There's one here along the shore, but there's another one that's sunk out in the middle of the bay here. If you drive over it in a boat, you can just see some of the scaffolding reaching up towards the surface. It's kind of creepy. But these dredges were seen in the summers out here on the bay, sucking stamp sands through this tube off the bottom, and they would pump it back to shore to process it. It's said in the last 25 years of operation, Calumet and Hecla made more money processing these stamp sands, again, to get that extra copper out of it, than they did in their underground mines. And that just shows how expensive underground mining is. You have to keep it watered, you have to keep the miners safe, you have to keep fresh air pumped down in there, dewatered. And that's why the mines in this area closed down. It wasn't because we ran out of copper, it's because open pit mines like are done elsewhere can be done with big, huge machinery with much fewer people. And that put the final nail in the coffin for Calumet and Hecla's Keweenaw mining operations.